The archivist who broke Rule 5. Some rules exist not to protect the archives, but to protect us from what the archives might reveal. My name is Elena Toretti, and I've served as Vatican archivist for 11 years. During that time, I've handled documents that could topple governments, letters that could rewrite church history, and manuscripts so ancient their parchment crumbles if you breathe too close. But nothing prepared me for the Borgia collection that arrived in December of 2023. The Vatican Secret Archive snow, called the Vatican Apostolic Archive, spans 85 kilometers of shelving across 17 climate-controlled chambers beneath St. Peter's Basilica. My office sits in the deepest section, sublevel C, where we house materials deemed too sensitive for standard preservation protocols. The air down here carries the weight of centuries. Incense, old leather, and something else is something that reminds you that holiness and horror often share the same breath. Cardinal Torriani delivered the Borgia manuscripts personally, which should have been my first warning. Cardinals don't make delivery runs. He appeared in my doorway one gray December afternoon, carrying a single archival box sealed with red wax, the kind reserved for materials requiring special handling protocols. "Sister Elena," he said, setting the box carefully on my examination table. "These require immediate cataloging under Archive Protocol 5. You understand the restrictions? Protocol 5. No work past midnight. No removal of materials from sublevel C. No photography without written authorization from 3 separate departments. Most importantly, no discussion of contents with unauthorized personnel, which, in practice, meant no discussion at all. Of course, Your Eminence." He lingered in my doorway, hands clasped behind his back. The previous archivist assigned to this collection, Father Benedetti, he requested reassignment. Personal reasons. His eyes met mine. "I trust you'll find the work manageable." That evening, I broke the seal. The box contained 12 manuscripts, each bound in different materials, some in cracked leather, others in what appeared to be human skin, though I preferred not to dwell on such possibilities. The documents dated from 1492 to 1503, during Pope Alexander VI's reign, Rodrigo Borgia's papacy. Even among Vatican archivists, the Borgias inspire whispered conversations and careful handling procedures. The manuscripts appeared to be personal correspondence, though written in a mixture of Latin, Italian, and what I initially assumed was code. My job was simple. Catalog each document, note its contents, photograph significant pages, and prepare detailed summaries for the Archive Committee's review. I should have paid closer attention to Protocol 5's midnight restriction. My first violation was accidental. I'd become absorbed in a particularly intriguing letter, something about papal audiences with visitors from beneath, when I noticed the clock reading 12:15. I quickly secured the materials and left, making a mental note to be more careful with my time management. The next morning, I found the manuscripts exactly as I'd left them. Or so I thought. It wasn't until I began transcribing the letter from the previous evening that I realized something had changed. The text I'd been reading, the passage about underground visitors' snow, discussed something entirely different. Instead of mysterious audiences, it described a young woman's funeral. A girl named Lucia who died in a riding accident at age 16. Lucia was my sister's name. She died in a car accident at 16, 23 years ago. I told myself it was a coincidence. Medieval documents often contained common names, and my memory could have been faulty about the previous evening's text. I photographed the page and continued working. But that night, I stayed late again. This time, deliberately. At 12:30, I was deep in another manuscript when I heard something that made my hands freeze over the parchment. Footsteps in the corridor, outside, slow, measured, like someone walking in procession. But I was alone on sublevel C. Security made their rounds at 11 and wouldn't return until 6 in the morning. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I held my breath, listening. After several minutes of silence, I crept to the doorway and peered into the hallway, empty. The motion sensors showed no activity except my own heat signature. When I returned to my desk, the manuscript had changed again. This time, the alteration was unmistakable. The page now contained a detailed description of a girl's confession, a 16-year-old, admitting to feelings of doubt about her faith, worry about disappointing her parents, and guilt over secretly reading romance novels borrowed from school friends. The handwriting looked remarkably similar to my own adolescent script, the same script I'd used in the confession letters I wrote but never gave to Father Marcus at our parish church. My hands shook as I photographed the page. In the morning, I promised myself I would report this to Cardinal Torriani. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps the manuscripts were treated with some kind of chemical that reacted to moisture or temperature changes, causing the ink to shift and reveal hidden text beneath. But I didn't report it, because when I arrived the next morning, I found something that made reporting impossible. The manuscript contained 3 new pages that hadn't been there before. Pages describing Lucia's last day, in excruciating detail her argument with our mother about taking the car, her phone call to me asking if I wanted to come along to the mall, my decision to stay home and study instead. Details that no medieval document could possibly contain. Details that only I remembered. The writing matched samples of my own handwriting perfectly. Not similar, identical. Down to the specific way I crossed my T's and the slight leftward slant of my L's. For 3 days, I avoided sub-level C entirely. I requested other assignments, caught up on administrative work, even volunteered to help with the Christmas decorations in the main library. But the Borgia manuscripts called to me with an urgency I couldn't explain. Cardinal Torriani began asking about my progress. Other archivists mentioned seeing lights in my office late at night, even though I hadn't been there. On the 4th night, I returned. This time, I arrived at 11:55, determined to work within Protocol 5's time limits. But as I opened the first manuscript, I realized the futility of my caution. The documents had been changing even when I wasn't there. New pages had appeared. Existing text had shifted and rearranged itself into increasingly personal revelations about Lucia, about me, about conversations we'd had that I'd never told another living soul. At exactly midnight, my desk lamp flickered. In that moment of darkness, I heard something that stopped my heart. A voice I hadn't heard in 23 years, speaking my name with the same teasing affection I remembered from childhood. "Elena, why didn't you come with me?" The lamp steadied, and I was alone again. But the manuscript in front of me now contained a single sentence. Written in Lucia's handwriting, the same looping script she'd used in the birthday cards she made me, in the notes she left on my bedroom door, in her diary that I'd read secretly after the funeral. "You were supposed to be in the car with me." I should have left then. Should have sealed the manuscripts, reported the incident, requested immediate reassignment like Father Benedetti. Instead, I found myself speaking to the empty room. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't come." The pages began turning themselves. New text appeared with each turn, all in Lucia's handwriting now, forming a conversation I'd dreamed about having for over 2 decades. She asked about my life, my work, whether I still missed her. She told me she wasn't angry about the car, that she understood why I'd chosen to stay home. She said she'd been waiting for a chance to talk, and somehow, these old manuscripts, these repositories of confessions and secrets had given her a voice. For hours, I wrote responses in the margins and watched as her replies appeared on subsequent pages. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings about psychological breaks, about grief-induced hallucinations, about the impossibility of what I was experiencing. But Lucia's voice, even in written form, felt more real than anything I'd encountered in 23 years. At 3:17 in the morning, She asked the question I'd been dreading. "Do you want to join me, Elena? Really join me?" The manuscript's pages began flipping rapidly, showing me images that shouldn't have been possible on medieval parchment photographs of the accident scene, medical reports from the hospital, even pages from Lucia's diary that had been buried with her. The final page showed a new entry, dated today, in my own handwriting. A confession that I'd been planning to leave the Vatican, leave the Church, leave everything behind because the weight of her absence had become unbearable. I hadn't written those words, but I'd thought them every day for 23 years. "Just stay until dawn," the manuscript read. "Let me show you everything I never got to tell you." My hand moved toward the page, ready to write yes, when I heard something that saved my life, the grinding mechanical sound of the archive's main door cycling through its morning unlock sequence. 6 a.m. Security's morning rounds were beginning. I slammed the manuscript shut and began securing the materials with shaking hands. As I placed each document back in its archival sleeve, I whispered a prayer I hadn't said since childhood, not the formal Latin prayers of my professional life, but the simple words my mother had taught us. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, protect us now and at the hour of our death." When I opened the box that afternoon, all the manuscripts had returned to their original state. The text about papal audiences and mysterious visitors was exactly as I'd first read it. No additional pages, no personal revelations, no traces of Lucia's handwriting. But tucked between the last two manuscripts, I found a single sheet of modern paper containing a message in Cardinal Torriani's handwriting. "Father Benedetti lasted 2 weeks. You've shown remarkable strength, Sister Elena. Perhaps it's time to discuss a new assignment." I never asked how he knew. Some conversations happen without words in the Vatican, and some knowledge is shared through glances and careful silences rather than direct discussion. That afternoon I was reassigned to the main archives on Sublevel A, where the materials are less sensitive and the protocols less restrictive. A new archivist arrived the following week, a young priest fresh from seminary, eager to prove himself capable of handling difficult assignments. I wanted to warn him about Protocol 5, about the importance of leaving before midnight, about the way grief and longing can make even holy places dangerous. But some lessons can only be learned in solitude. In the depths of the archives, when the boundary between memory and mystery becomes thin enough to cross. I still work late sometimes, but never past 11:30. And when I hear footsteps in empty corridors or catch glimpses of familiar handwriting in unexpected places, I remind myself that some conversations, no matter how desperately we need Themar, meant to remain unfinished. The Borgia manuscripts are still there, in Sublevel C, waiting for the next archivist brave or foolish enough to break Rule 5. Some rules exist not to protect the archives, but to protect us from what the archives might reveal. The Vatican keeps time differently after midnight, and some voices carry further in the sacred darkness than they should. My name is Marco Santelli, and I've worked night security at the Vatican for 7 years. People assume our job is ceremonial walking marble corridors where nothing happens, protecting treasures behind bulletproof glass, keeping watch over empty chapels. They don't understand that the Vatican never truly sleeps. After midnight, when the tourists are gone and the clergy retire to their quarters, the Holy See reveals aspects of itself that daylight visitors never witness. My shift begins at 10 in the evening and ends at 6 in the morning. 8 hours of walking predetermined routes through the Apostolic Palace, the museums, and the Apostolic Library. Every guard carries a handheld scanner that logs our presence at specific checkpoints throughout the complex. The system tracks our movements down to the minute, ensuring we maintain proper coverage and timing. The routes never vary. Corridor 7 to the Pinacoteca, sweep the Renaissance galleries, checkpoint scan at the Raphael rooms, down to sub-level B for the manuscript storage areas, up through the map gallery, final scan at the Sistine Chapel approach. 3 complete circuits per shift, with the second round always beginning at exactly 3:17 in the morning. I never questioned why that specific time mattered until the voices started. The Apostolic Library occupies 4 floors of the Vatican complex, housing over 1.6 million books and 80,000 manuscripts. During night rounds, we're required to walk every public corridor and scan checkpoints in the restricted reading rooms. The library feels different in darkness, not threatening, exactly, but expectant, as if the accumulated knowledge of centuries creates its own form of consciousness. My grandmother, Nonna Francesca, used to say that libraries remember everything whispered between their walls. She died when I was 12, but I still remember her voice during the rosary prayers she recited over my crib when I was sick. She spoke in the old Latin, the formal ecclesiastical pronunciation she'd learned from her own grandmother, passed down through generations of women who never attended seminary, but knew the sacred language better than most priests. The first time I heard my name in the library, I assumed it was Father Toretti working late in the manuscript room, Marcus Aurelius Santelli. Spoken in perfect Latin pronunciation, the way my baptismal name appeared on church records. But when I checked the restricted areas, all doors were locked and alarm systems showed no interior movement. I noted the incident in my security log: possible audio disturbance, level 2, 0320 hours, and continued my rounds. The Vatican generates strange acoustics at night. Sound carries through ventilation systems and stone corridors in unexpected ways. Conversations from the papal apartments sometimes echo through the basement levels. Heating pipes create sounds that can resemble human voices. But the voice I heard pronounced my name correctly. Not Marco, the way everyone calls me, but Marcus Aurelius, the full Latin construction my grandmother insisted on using, even when my parents preferred the modern Italian version. The second night, it happened again. Same time, same location, same pronunciation. This time, the voice continued beyond my name, speaking words I couldn't understand but somehow recognized. The cadence matched my grandmother's evening prayers, the rhythm of Latin syllables she'd whispered when she thought I was sleeping. I began carrying my phone during rounds, ready to record any unusual audio. But electronic devices behave strangely in the Vatican's older sections. Batteries drain faster than they should. Digital recordings often capture static where clear sounds should be. The building's electrical systems date back decades, layered over centuries-old architecture that creates interference with modern technology. On the 4th night, I broke protocol. Instead of continuing my standard route after the library checkpoint, I remained in the manuscript reading room, sitting quietly in the darkness with my scanner muted. The Vatican security system allows for reasonable delays. Guards sometimes need extra time to investigate unusual sounds or check door seals, but remaining stationary for extended periods triggers supervisory alerts. At 3:17 exactly, I heard my grandmother's voice. Not similar to her voice, not a sound that reminded me of her prayers. Her actual voice, speaking the exact Latin phrases she used during my childhood illnesses, pronouncing each word with the careful precision she'd learned from the old country priests who'd trained her mother. Marcus Aurelius Santelli, Filius Benedictus, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Blessed Son Marcus Aurelius Santelli, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. The words came from the manuscript storage area. Behind locked doors I didn't have clearance to open, but the voice carried through the walls as clearly as if she were standing beside me, the way she had when I was 7 years old and burning with fever, when she'd stayed awake all night reciting prayers for my recovery. I understood then why my grandmother had insisted on teaching me those prayers phonetically. She'd made me repeat the Latin sounds even though I didn't know their meanings. Someday, she'd said, You'll need to remember these words exactly as I say them. The prayers continued for 11 minutes. I timed them on my watch. The same duration as my grandmother's evening recitations. Every inflection matched my memories perfectly, including the slight pause she always made before "Et ne nos inducas in tentationem," and "lead us not into temptationes," if those particular words required extra consideration. When the voice stopped, I remained motionless for another 20 minutes, waiting for some explanation or continuation. The silence stretched so completely that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing off the stone walls. Finally, my radio crackled with a message from the security supervisor, checking on my delayed checkpoint scan. I resumed my rounds and completed the shift without further incident. But I couldn't shake the sensation that something had changed in the library, as if my presence during the prayers had established a connection that hadn't existed before. The following night, the voice began earlier, 3:15 instead of 3:17. And instead of ending with the familiar bedtime prayers, it continued into territory I'd never heard before, Latin phrases that sounded like formal church liturgy, but spoken with my grandmother's inflection and timing. Over the following weeks, the prayers expanded. Each night brought new Latin passages, always in my grandmother's voice, always beginning with my full baptismal name, always timed to my library rounds. I began researching the phrases, using translation websites, and consulting with Father Martinez from the Vatican language department. The prayers, he told me, were extremely old, pre-Vatican II formulations, the kind spoken in rural Italian parishes before the reforms of the 1960s. Some of the phrases appeared in manuscripts dating back to the 13th century. "Where did you encounter these particular words?" he asked. I couldn't explain without sounding mentally unstable. Instead, I told him I'd found them in my grandmother's prayer book and wanted to understand their meaning. He provided written translations, which I studied during my off hours. The prayers were petitions for protection. Specifically, requests that guardian spirits watch over young children during times of illness or danger. The Latin included references to custodia nocturna, night guardianship, and asked for vigilantia perpetua, eternal vigilance, over the named child. My grandmother had been asking for supernatural protection for me. And somehow, nearly 15 years after her death, those prayers were continuing in the Vatican Library. The climax came on a Thursday morning in February. I'd arrived for my 3:17 library checkpoint as usual, but this time, the voice didn't wait for me to reach the manuscript area. It began speaking as soon as I entered the main reading room, and the words were in modern Italian rather than Latin. "Marco, mio caro nipote." Marco, my dear grandson. She spoke as if no time had passed since her death, asking about my work, my health, whether I was eating properly. Her voice carried the same concerned affection I remembered from childhood visits, the way she'd fuss over me while preparing elaborate Sunday dinners. I found myself responding aloud, telling her about my job, my apartment in Trastevere, my girlfriend Elena who worked at the Vatican post office. The conversation felt natural, like the evening talks we'd had when I visited her in the hospital during her final illness. Then she asked me something that made my blood freeze. "Marco, do you remember the last prayer I taught you? The one I made you promise never to forget?" I didn't remember any special final prayer. My memories of her last days were fragmented, the confusion of medications, her difficulty speaking, the way she'd slip between Italian and the old dialect from her childhood village. "I'm sorry, Nana. I don't remember." "Close your eyes, Caro. Listen carefully." What followed was 15 minutes of Latin so complex and ancient that I knew immediately I'd never heard it before. Yet as she spoke, I found myself understanding every word. The prayer was a binding, a request that the spirits who had protected me in life continue their vigilance after death. It asked that my guardian's voice be permitted to speak across the boundary between worlds, but only in sacred places where such communication was sanctified by centuries of prayer. The prayer was a loophole, a way for my grandmother to continue protecting me from beyond death, using the accumulated spiritual power of the Vatican itself as a conduit for her voice. As she finished the final Latin phrase, I realized that I was supposed to respond. The prayer required an acknowledgement, a formal acceptance of the continued protection. The words came to my mouth without conscious thought, as if she'd taught them to me decades ago and they'd been waiting dormant in my memory. Gratias tibiago, custos fidelis, vigilantium tuum humiliter accipio. Thank you, faithful guardian. I humbly accept your vigilance. The silence that followed felt complete, not empty, but fulfilled. I understood that the conversation was finished, not just for that night, but permanently. My grandmother had done what she came to do, ensure that I understood her continued presence and formally accepted her protection. I completed my rounds without incident and filed a standard security report with no mention of unusual sounds or experiences. The voice never returned, but sometimes, during my 317 library rounds, I catch the faint scent of my grandmother's rosewater perfume or hear the soft whisper of prayers in Latin drifting through the manuscript storage area. The sounds never form words now, just the gentle rhythm of familiar devotions continued by a love that death couldn't diminish. Father Martinez mentioned to me recently that the Vatican's acoustic properties allow certain types of spiritual communication, particularly in areas where centuries of prayer have saturated the walls with sacred intention. He said this with the casual tone priests use when discussing miracles that can't be officially acknowledged, but are too common to deny. I never told him that I'd found the source of those ancient prayers he'd helped me translate. Some mysteries are meant to remain in the darkness, protected by the same love that brought them into being. The Vatican keeps time differently after midnight, and some voices carry further in the sacred darkness than they should. But now I understand that's not a glitch in the system, it's exactly how it's supposed to work. Some stains resist even the most careful restoration, as if the sacred image remembers what it was meant to represent. My name is Father Joachim Brennan, and I've spent 18 years as a restoration specialist in the Vatican museums. During that time, I've cleaned frescoes by Michelangelo, restored altarpieces by Caravaggio, and preserved manuscripts that predate the printing press. But nothing in my training prepared me for the crucifixion fresco hidden in the Borgia apartment's sealed chamber. The Vatican Museum's house over 9 miles of galleries displaying 4,000 years of artistic achievement. Most visitors see the popular collections, the Sistine Chapel, the Raphael rooms, the Pinacoteca's Renaissance masterpieces. They don't know about the restoration workshops beneath the main galleries, where damaged or sensitive artworks undergo careful preservation away from public view. My laboratory occupies a climate-controlled space in Sublevel D, accessible only through the Conservation Department's secure entrance. The walls are lined with specialized equipment, infrared scanners, chemical analysis stations, microscopes capable of revealing paint layers invisible to the naked eye. Temperature stays constant at 18 degrees Celsius. Humidity never varies from 55%. These conditions prevent further deterioration while we work to reverse centuries of damage. The Borgia fresco arrived on a Tuesday morning in October of 2024, transported by Cardinal Torriani personally, rather than through normal museum channels. He supervised the installation himself, watching as my assistants secured the panel on my primary easel. "Father Brennan," he said, removing his glasses to clean them with unnecessary care, "this piece requires discretionary handling. No photography without written authorization. No discussion with unauthorized personnel. Complete documentation of all procedures and observations." The fresco depicted Christ's crucifixion in the Byzantine style popular during the 14th century. Unlike later Renaissance interpretations that emphasized human suffering, this image focused on Christ's divine nature. His face remained serene, despite the wounds on his hands, feet, and side. Gold leaf halos surrounded his head, and those of the two thieves crucified beside him. The background showed Jerusalem rendered in the symbolic rather than realistic style of medieval religious art. The paint showed typical signs of age's surface grime, minor cracking, areas where humidity had caused slight lifting of the pigment layers. Standard restoration work. I began with photographic documentation, recording the fresco's condition before any cleaning commenced. During the initial examination, I noticed something unusual. Moisture marks around Christ's wounds appeared fresher than the surrounding damage, as if these areas had been affected by water exposure long after the rest of the fresco had stabilized. The staining patterns didn't match any typical deterioration I'd encountered. Instead of the random distribution caused by humidity or roof leaks, the moisture seemed to emerge from specific points on the painted wounds themselves. I tested the humidity levels around the fresco multiple times. The readings remained constant. No pipes ran through the walls that could cause localized moisture. The climate control system showed no irregularities. Yet each morning when I arrived at the laboratory, I found new moisture around Christ's painted wound-stony droplets that hadn't been there when I'd left the previous evening. My initial cleaning efforts followed standard protocols. I began with the gentlest possible approach cotton swabs dampened with deionized water to remove surface dirt without disturbing the original paint layers. Medieval frescoes require particular care because the painters often mixed their pigments with unusual binding agents that can react unpredictably to modern conservation chemicals. The cleaning proceeded normally until I reached Christ's wounds. The moment my swab touched the painted blood on his hands, fresh moisture began seeping through the paint. Not the slow emergence of trapped humidity that sometimes occurs during restoration, but active bleeding, as if the painted wounds contained an actual circulatory system. I stopped work immediately and documented the phenomenon with detailed notes and measurements. The moisture appeared only when I directly contacted the wound areas. When I cleaned other portions of the fresco Christ's face, his robes, the background architecture, no unusual effects occurred. But any contact with the painted blood on his hands, feet, or side produced immediate seepage. The liquid appeared reddish-brown, consistent with aged blood, though I initially assumed this was pigment dissolved by my cleaning solution. I collected samples for analysis, following the Conservation Department's protocols for documenting unusual discoveries during restoration work. The laboratory analysis revealed something impossible. The liquid wasn't dissolved pigment. It was human blood, fresh human blood, despite emerging from a 600-year-old painting. The lab technician ran the tests 3 times, believing he'd contaminated the samples. Each result confirmed the same conclusion. The substance seeping from Christ's painted wounds was type A positive blood, containing active red blood cells and a complete spectrum of human proteins. I checked my own medical records. Type A positive. For 3 days, I couldn't bring myself to return to the restoration work. I researched similar phenomena in conservation literature, consulted with colleagues at other museums, even reached out to medical professionals who might explain how fresh blood could emerge from ancient paint. No one had encountered anything comparable. Cardinal Torriani visited on the 4th day, asking about my progress. I showed him the documentation photographs of the moisture seepage, laboratory reports confirming the blood analysis, detailed notes about the impossibility of what I was observing. He studied the reports without surprise, as if he'd expected these results. Father Brennan, in your professional opinion, can the restoration proceed safely? Your Eminence, I don't understand what's happening. The blood appears to be mine, but that's scientifically impossible. The fresco predates blood typing by centuries. There has to be a rational explanation. Perhaps, he said, returning the documents to my desk. But rational or not, can you complete the restoration? That afternoon I resumed cleaning with extreme caution. I avoided the wound areas entirely, focusing on Christ's face and the surrounding figures. The work proceeded normally until I reached the section directly above Christ's head, where the artist had painted a small crack in the scia detail I hadn't noticed during my initial examination. As I cleaned this area, the crack began to widen. Not the paint cracking, the actual sky in the painting was opening, revealing a darkness beyond that seemed to extend far deeper than the fresco's surface should allow. Through this opening, I could see movement, shadows that suggested vast spaces existing behind or within the painted image. I set down my tools and stepped back from the easel. The crack continued expanding. Accompanied by a sound I felt more than heard, a resonance that seemed to emerge from the painting itself, like distant voices calling from an immense depth. Then I saw them, faces appearing in the darkness beyond the crack, looking out at me with expressions of profound sorrow. Not demonic faces or supernatural horrors, but human faces marked by suffering so complete it transcended physical pain. They weren't trying to escape or communicate, they simply watched, their presence serving as witness to something I couldn't comprehend. The bleeding from Christ's wounds intensified. Fresh blood now flowed steadily from his hands and feet, dripping onto my laboratory floor despite the impossibility of liquid emerging from dried paint. But the blood wasn't pooling normally. Instead, it moved across the floor in thin streams, forming patterns that resembled script Latin words I couldn't quite read, as if the blood itself was attempting to communicate. I tried to photograph the phenomena, but my camera malfunctioned. The images showed only the original fresco in its damaged state. No sign of the bleeding wounds or the crack in the sky. Digital recordings captured silence where I heard the resonant voices. My eyes saw impossibilities that technology couldn't detect or preserve. As I watched, one of the faces in the darkness beyond the crack began to move closer. I recognized the features my own face, but marked by a suffering I'd never experienced. This other version of myself looked directly at me and spoke, though I heard the words not through my ears but as thoughts forming in my mind. "The blood remembers," my other self said. "Every drop spilled in faith, every wound offered in love. The paint holds memory deeper than pigment can contain." I understood then that the fresco wasn't simply depicting Christ's crucifixion, it was somehow connected to every act of sacrifice and suffering offered in Christ's name throughout history. The blood seeping from the painted wounds wasn't mine alone, but mine mixed with that of countless others who had given their lives in service to something greater than themselves. The vision lasted perhaps 10 minutes. When it ended, the crack in the sky had sealed itself, the faces in the darkness had withdrawn, and the bleeding from Christ's wounds had stopped. The laboratory returned to its normal state-controlled temperature. Steady humidity, the familiar smell of conservation chemicals. But on my laboratory floor, I found a single drop of blood that hadn't evaporated or been absorbed. When I tested this sample, the results showed something that shook my understanding of everything I thought I knew about reality. The blood contained genetic markers from dozens of different individuals, all type A positive, spanning centuries of historical time periods. I completed the restoration over the following weeks, working carefully around Christ's wounds, which no longer bled when touched, but remained somehow different from the rest of the fresco, more vivid, more present, as if painted yesterday rather than 6 centuries ago. Cardinal Torriani approved my final report, which documented the cleaning and preservation work without mentioning the supernatural elements I'd witnessed. Some experiences, I learned, are meant to remain private, shared only in the sacred silence between the observer and the observed. The fresco now hangs in a private chapel accessible only to certain members of the Vatican hierarchy. Sometimes, when I walk past during my evening rounds, I catch a glimpse of moisture around Christ's wounds, not actively bleeding, but ready to, as if the image maintains an eternal willingness to share in human suffering. I've never told anyone about the faces I saw beyond the crack in the sky, or about the blood that contained memories spanning centuries. But sometimes, during Mass, when I look at the crucifix above the altar, I remember what my other self told me. The blood remembers. And I understand that some stains resist restoration not because they're damaged, but because they're exactly as they're meant to be. Sacred texts are meant to speak to the faithful. But some manuscripts listen first. My name is Sister Catherine Delacroix, and I've served as manuscript curator in the Vatican Apostolic Library for 13 years. During that time, I've cataloged medieval prayer books, preserved illuminated gospels, and maintained climate-controlled environments for documents so ancient their very existence defies the natural decay of centuries. But nothing in my training prepared me for the codex that arrived on the feast day of St. Jerome in September of 2024. The Vatican Apostolic Library houses the world's most significant collection of religious manuscripts, spanning 2 millennia of Christian scholarship. My responsibilities focus on the special collections documents requiring individual climate control, restricted access, and continuous monitoring for signs of deterioration. These materials occupy a separate wing of Sublevel C, accessible only through biometric scanners, and accompanied by detailed logging of every interaction. Each manuscript in special collections receives a custom preservation environment. Temperature and humidity adjust automatically based on the specific needs of different materials: parchment, vellum, various inks and binding materials that react differently to environmental changes. Motion sensors track all movement within the collection areas. Security cameras record every moment spent with these irreplaceable documents. The codex arrived without prior notification, delivered personally by Cardinal Torriani during my afternoon cataloging session. He carried it in a climate-controlled transport case, the kind reserved for the most delicate acquisitions. The manuscript itself appeared unremarkably a 13th century illuminated Bible, probably produced in a French monastery, bound in leather that showed appropriate signs of age. Sister Catherine, the Cardinal said, placing the transport case carefully on my examination table, this manuscript requires special attention, extended study, detailed analysis. Take whatever time you need. He paused at my doorway before leaving. Document everything, every observation, every detail, no matter how seemingly insignificant. I began with standard preservation protocols: photographic documentation of the binding, measurement of dimensions, assessment of the parchment's condition. The illuminations showed typical medieval craftsmanship: elaborate initial letters decorated with gold leaf, marginal illustrations of saints and biblical scenes, text written in the formal Gothic script common to 13th century scriptoriums. The marginalia caught my attention immediately. Medieval manuscripts often contain notes added by later readers' corrections, commentary, cross-references to other texts. But this codex contained marginalia I'd never seen before. Personal observations written in multiple hands, spanning several centuries, all addressing questions of faith and doubt with remarkable candor. One note, written in 14th century script, read, "What if our prayers reach only empty air?" Another, in Renaissance Italian, "The silence of God becomes louder each year." A third, in what appeared to be 18th century French, "Faith feels like speaking to oneself in a dark room." These weren't the typical scholarly annotations found in most historical manuscripts. They were confessions, admissions of spiritual struggle written by readers who had obviously spent time alone with this particular text. The raw honesty disturbed me more than I expected. During my third day with the Codex, I noticed something that made me question my own observational skills. While transcribing a passage from the book of Matthew, I glanced at marginalia I'd photographed the previous day. The note that had read, "What if our prayers reach only empty air?" now said something different. What if our doubts prove our humanity rather than our weakness? I checked my photographs. The images clearly showed the original text about prayers reaching empty air, but the manuscript in front of me contained different words entirely. I assumed I'd misread the medieval script. Gothic handwriting can be difficult to interpret, especially when written in faded ink on aged parchment. But over the following days, I began noticing other changes. Marginal notes appeared in positions that had been blank the day before. Existing annotations shifted their wording, sometimes completely reversing their meaning. A note questioning the existence of divine mercy became an affirmation of God's infinite compassion. A confession of religious doubt transformed into a statement of renewed faith. The changes seemed to occur overnight, when the manuscript was secured in its climate-controlled storage. I began staying later, observing the Codex during different times of day, hoping to catch the moment when these alterations occurred. But the text remained stable under direct observation. Changes only manifested between my visits, as if the manuscript required privacy to reveal its true nature. 2 weeks into my study, I experienced a crisis of faith that had been building for months. My sister Marie had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer the previous spring. Despite countless prayers, novenas, and masses offered for her healing, her condition continued deteriorating. She'd begun asking questions I couldn't answer. Why does God allow suffering? What purpose does pain serve? If divine love is infinite, why do the innocent suffer while the guilty prosper? These questions haunted my prayer life. During evening vespers, instead of finding comfort in familiar psalms, I found myself silently questioning everything I'd built my religious life around. Did my prayers actually accomplish anything? Was faith simply elaborate self-deception? Did God hear us? Or were we speaking into an indifferent universe that only appeared to listen? The morning after a particularly difficult phone call with Marie, I found new marginalia in the Codex that directly addressed these unspoken doubts. Written in fresh ink that appeared to be my own handwriting. Sister Catherine, your questions honor God more than blind acceptance ever could. Doubt and faith are not opposites, they are partners in the search for truth. I stared at the page for several minutes, certain I was experiencing some form of psychological break. I hadn't written anything in the manuscript. I'd been trained to never mark historical documents, never add contemporary annotations to medieval texts. The handwriting looked like mine, but I had no memory of creating it. That afternoon, I decided to test what I was experiencing. Alone in the special collections chamber, I opened the Codex to the Book of Job, the biblical text that most directly addresses suffering and divine justice. I placed my hands on the open pages and spoke my questions aloud for the first time. Why doesn't God heal my sister? What's the point of faith if prayer doesn't change anything? Am I wasting my life serving something that might not exist? As I spoke, I watched the margins of the open pages. Nothing happened immediately. But over the course of an hour, new text began appearing, not emerging from blank parchment, but forming gradually, as if written by an invisible hand using ink that required time to become visible. The responses appeared in medieval Latin, written in the same Gothic script as the original manuscript. But I understood every word perfectly, despite my limited knowledge of ecclesiastical Latin. The text didn't provide easy answers. Instead, it offered companionship in questioning. Suffering exists not as punishment, but as the price of existence in a world where love is freely chosen rather than compelled. Your sister's pain does not diminish. Divine love, it proves that love includes the courage to create beings capable of genuine suffering. More text appeared. Prayer changes not the external world, but the heart that prays. Your sister may not be healed in the way you desire, but your love for her, expressed through prayer, becomes part of the eternal conversation between human hearts and divine mystery. The final passage addressed my deepest fear. Faith is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to continue seeking truth despite uncertainty. Your questions do not disqualify you from religious life, they qualify you for it. Those who never doubt have never truly believed. I sat in the special collections chamber until well past midnight, watching as the codex responded to thoughts I'd never spoken aloud. The manuscript seemed to understand not just my questions, but the emotional context behind them, the guilt I felt for doubting, the fear that my religious vocation was built on self-deception, the desperate need for some assurance that suffering serves a purpose. As dawn approached, I asked the manuscript one final question. The response appeared immediately, written in contemporary English rather than medieval Latin. I am what happens when centuries of seekers pour their hearts onto sacred pages. Every doubt, every question, every moment of crisis has been absorbed into these margins. I am the collective wisdom of all who have struggled with faith before you. The manuscript continued. Your doubts become part of me now, Sister Catherine. Future readers will find comfort in knowing they are not alone in their questions. This is how sacred texts truly serve not by providing easy answers, but by proving that the search for truth is itself sacred. When I returned the following morning, the new text had faded, leaving only the original 13th century manuscript. But the marginal notes from previous centuries remained, and I now understood their purpose. Each annotation represented someone's honest struggle with faith, preserved across time to offer companionship to future seekers. Cardinal Torriani visited a week later to review my findings. I provided him with detailed documentation of the manuscript's physical condition and historical significance, but made no mention of the interactive marginalia I'd experienced. Some mysteries are meant to remain private, shared only between the seeker and the text that listens. The codex now rests in special collections, available to qualified researchers who request access for legitimate scholarly purposes. I sometimes observe these visitors through the security monitors, watching as they read the ancient text with growing intensity, occasionally pausing to stare at marginal notes that seem to speak directly to their personal circumstances. I never told anyone about the conversations I had with the manuscript, or about the comfort I found in learning that doubt and faith can coexist. But sometimes, during my evening rounds through the special collections, I catch glimpses of fresh marginalia appearing in various manuscripts, not just the codex, but other texts as well, responding to the private questions of contemporary readers who seek wisdom in ancient words. Marie died 3 months later, but her final weeks were marked by peace rather than despair. She told me that her questions about suffering had led her to a deeper understanding of love, not the elimination of pain, but the willingness to remain present with others in their pain. I believe the Codex taught me something similar. Sacred texts don't provide easy answers, but they offer sacred companionship in the search for truth. Some manuscripts listen as much as they speak, and the most profound conversations happen in the margins, where human hearts meet divine mystery in the safety of shared uncertainty. Some confessions echo through chambers that exist only when the need for absolution becomes unbearable. My name is Giuseppe Alberti, and I've worked maintenance for the Vatican museums for 22 years. During that time, I've cleaned every public gallery, polished marble floors worn smooth by millions of pilgrims, and maintained climate systems that preserve art spanning 4 millennia. But nothing in my experience prepared me for the confession booth that appeared in the Sistine Chapel on the night of November 23, 2024. My shift begins at 11 in the evening, after the last tourists have departed and the security systems have cycled to overnight mode. The Vatican museums require constant maintenance cetus control, humidity monitoring, minor repairs that can't be performed during public hours. My route covers the major galleries in a specific sequence designed to minimize disruption to the building's environmental systems. The Sistine Chapel receives special attention. Michelangelo's frescoes require precise atmospheric conditions to prevent further deterioration from the moisture and carbon dioxide generated by thousands of daily visitors. Each night, I perform detailed cleaning of the chapel floor, walls, and benches, followed by calibration of the air filtration systems that protect the ceiling from accumulated pollutants. The work requires reverence as much as skill. Standing alone beneath the creation of Adam, surrounded by the artistic achievement that represents the pinnacle of human creativity inspired by divine vision, reminds me why I chose this profession. My grandfather worked as a stonemason on Vatican construction projects during the 1950s. My father served as a gardener in the Vatican courtyards. For the Alberti family, maintaining God's house has always been both occupation and calling. The confession booth appeared during my third week of November rounds. I'd completed my standard cleaning routine and was performing final checks on the chapel's environmental systems when I noticed an additional structure near the entrance that hadn't been there during previous visits. The booth was constructed in the traditional style-carved wooden panels, burgundy velvet curtains, brass fixtures that matched the chapel's other liturgical elements. But its placement seemed wrong. The Sistine Chapel contains no permanent confession facilities. Sacramental activities occur in the chapel only during specific ceremonies, with temporary furnishings installed and removed as needed. I checked the maintenance schedules for any notation about new installations. Nothing. I consulted the architectural plans stored in my equipment locker. According to official documentation, no confession facility existed in that location. I assumed someone had installed the booth for an upcoming ceremony and failed to notify the maintenance department. Vatican bureaucracy sometimes creates communication gaps between different administrative divisions. I made a note to inquire about the installation during my next shift and continued with my rounds. The following night, the booth remained in place. This time, I examined it more closely. The wood showed appropriate signs of wear from human contact. The velvet curtains carried the faint scent of incense absorption that develops only through years of liturgical use. But the booth's presence continued to puzzle me. No ceremony was scheduled that would require confession facilities. The chapel's booking calendar, which I accessed through the maintenance department's scheduling system, showed no special events requiring additional furnishings. On the third night, I found the booth's entrance curtain slightly parted. Vatican protocol requires investigation of any irregularities during overnight maintenance rounds. If someone had gained unauthorized access to the chapel, I needed to document the intrusion and report it to security. I approached the booth cautiously, listening for sounds that might indicate human presence. From inside the booth, I heard a voice speaking in what sounded like confessional prayer. But the language wasn't contemporary Italian or Latin. The speaker used an archaic dialect I recognized but hadn't heard in decades the specific regional variation my great-grandfather had spoken, the linguistic remnant of a small village in Calabria that modern Italian had gradually displaced. The voice was my own. I stood outside the booth, listening to myself confess childhood sins in a language I'd never learned to speak fluently. The voice recounted incidents from my early years with accuracy that unsettled mess-stealing fruit from a neighbor's tree at age 7, lying to my parents about breaking my mother's rosary beads, the jealousy I'd felt toward my younger brother that I'd never admitted to anyone. But the confessions extended beyond my actual childhood memories. The voice described sins I'd never committed, temptations I'd never experienced, moral failures that belonged to someone else's life. Yet the voice remained unmistakably mine, speaking with the same inflections and tonal patterns I recognized from recorded messages. I should have reported the incident immediately. Should have contacted security, documented the unauthorized presence, followed established protocols for investigating irregularities. Instead, I found myself drawn toward the booth's entrance, compelled by a need I couldn't articulate. The interior appeared larger than the external dimensions should have allowed. Traditional confession booths contain cramped spaces designed for kneeling supplicants, but this structure seemed to expand inward, creating room for contemplation and extended prayer. The kneeler was positioned before a wooden screen carved with intricate religious symbols. I didn't recognize a not traditional Catholic iconography, but something older, more primitive. As I knelt, the confessions continued flowing from my mouth without conscious direction. I heard myself admitting to moral failures, spanning generations, not just my own sins, but those of my father, my grandfather, ancestors I'd never known. The voice spoke of pride that led to family divisions, greed that caused community harm, failures of compassion that created lasting wounds. Through the carved screen, I could see movement in the priest's compartment. Shadows shifted behind the wooden barrier, suggesting human presence, but no voice responded to my confessions. The listening presence felt ancient, patient, as if it had been waiting decades for someone to finally speak these particular sins aloud. The experience lasted perhaps 30 minutes. When it ended, I found myself outside the booth, with no memory of exiting. The chapel had returned to its normal state, silent, empty, illuminated only by the security lighting that allows overnight maintenance work. But the booth remained in place, its presence now feeling permanent rather than temporary. Over the following weeks, I found myself returning to the booth each night during my Sistine Chapel rounds. The compulsion felt liturgical rather than psychological, not obsession, but obligation, as if the chapel itself required this nightly ritual of confession and absolution. Each session revealed different layers of family history. The voice that emerged from my mouth spoke sins committed by Alberti ancestors across centuries. I heard confessions of moral compromises made during wars, betrayals that protected family at the cost of community, spiritual failures that had echoed through generations without resolution. The listening presence behind the screen never spoke, but I began to sense its responses. Sometimes the shadows shifted in ways that suggested approval or understanding. Other times, the movement conveyed disappointment or sorrow. The communication occurred through presence rather than words, creating a form of absolution that transcended formal sacramental language. During the 4th week, I decided to investigate the priest's compartment. After completing my usual confession, I circled around to the booth's exterior and attempted to access the listening area. The door opened easily, revealing a space that should have contained seating for a confessor. Instead, I found emptiness, not vacant space, but actual emptiness, an absence so complete it seemed to absorb light and sound. Yet the shadows continued moving within this void, forming patterns that suggested robed figures kneeling in prayer. The movements followed liturgical rhythms, as if invisible priests were performing sacramental duties for penitents who existed only in memory. I understood then that the booth served confessions spanning time as well as space. The ancestors whose sins emerged from my voice had never received proper absolution. Their moral failures had accumulated across generations, creating spiritual debt that required acknowledgement and forgiveness before it could be resolved. The booth provided a mechanism for retroactive confession. By speaking their sins aloud in the sacred space of the Sistine Chapel, Beneath Michelangelo's vision of divine judgment and mercy, I was offering my ancestors the sacramental opportunity they'd never received during their lifetimes. The final confession occurred on December 21st, the winter solstice. This time, the voice that emerged spoke sins that belonged to future generations, moral failures that hadn't yet occurred, temptations that awaited my children and grandchildren, spiritual challenges that would require courage and wisdom I couldn't yet provide. I realized the booth offered not just retroactive absolution, but preventive grace. By acknowledging future failures before they occurred, by confessing temptations before they led to sin, I was creating spiritual protection for descendants who would face their own moral testing. When the session ended, the booth began to fade, not disappearing dramatically, but gradually becoming less substantial, as if it had fulfilled its purpose and no longer needed to manifest in physical form. I completed my maintenance rounds and filed standard reports documenting the chapel's condition. I never mentioned the confession booth to supervisors or colleagues. Some experiences transcend institutional protocols and require private processing. The booth hasn't appeared since that winter night, but I sometimes catch glimpses of its outline near the chapel entrance, visible only in peripheral vision, suggesting its continued availability for anyone whose family history requires spiritual resolution. I still work the overnight maintenance shift, still maintain the sacred spaces that house humanity's greatest artistic achievements. But now I understand that my work involves more than cleaning and climate control. Some forms of maintenance address spiritual as well as physical deterioration, preserving not just artistic masterpieces, but the moral heritage they represent. The Vatican contains chambers for every form of human need, including needs that span generations. Some confessions require extraordinary measures, and some forms of absolution transcend the boundaries between past, present, and future. Some instruments of communication serve masters who have been waiting centuries to complete their unfinished correspondence. My name is Father David Okafor, and I've served as Papal Secretary for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith for 8 years. During that time, I've drafted thousands of letters, managed correspondence with bishops worldwide, and maintained the precise administrative protocols that keep Vatican bureaucracy functioning across 6 continents. But nothing in my experience prepared me for the typewriter that began finishing my work during Lent of 2025. The Vatican Secretariat occupies the 3rd floor of the Apostolic Palace, where rooms lined with filing cabinets and communication equipment facilitate the Holy See's global correspondence. My office overlooks St. Peter's Square through windows that have witnessed papal audiences, consistories, and moments of church history that shaped the modern world. The work requires linguistic precision, theological accuracy, and diplomatic sensitivity that can take years to develop. My daily routine involves drafting responses to doctrinal inquiries, preparing briefing documents for cardinal meetings, and maintaining correspondence files that preserve the institutional memory of church decisions. Each letter requires multiple drafts, careful review, and final approval from superiors before distribution. The process demands attention to canonical law, liturgical tradition, and pastoral sensitivity that reflects the Vatican's role as spiritual authority for over 1 billion Catholics. The typewriter arrived as part of an office modernization initiative, ironically, a return to mechanical equipment after years of computer-based correspondence. Cardinal Torriani explained that certain sensitive documents required production on non-digital equipment to prevent electronic surveillance or hacking. The machine was a restored 1958 Olivetti Lettera, refurbished to original specifications but equipped with contemporary ribbon technology. I'd worked with manual typewriters during my seminary years in Lagos, so the transition felt comfortable rather than burdensome. The mechanical precision required for clean typing actually improved my writing discipline, forcing more careful consideration of word choice and sentence structure before committing thoughts to paper. The anomalies began during the second week of Lent. I was drafting a response to Bishop Martelli regarding liturgical music guidelines when I stepped away from my desk to consult reference materials in the office library. When I returned 10 minutes later, the letter had been completed in my absence. Not just finished, but improved, translated from my functional Italian into elegant medieval Latin that demonstrated mastery of ecclesiastical syntax I'd never achieved. The content remained faithful to my intended message, but the language reflected centuries-old formulations used in papal documents before the Second Vatican Council. Phrases like nobis placut and apostolica auctoritate appeared with grammatical precision that suggested deep familiarity with traditional chancery style. I assumed a colleague had entered my office and completed the work as a helpful gesture. Vatican secretaries sometimes assist each other during busy periods, and several of my associates possessed superior Latin skills developed through years of archival research. I made a mental note to thank whoever had provided the assistance, and continued with my afternoon schedule. But the following day, it happened again. This time, I deliberately left a half-finished letter on my desk while attending a 15-minute meeting in Cardinal Torriani's office. I locked my door and carried the only key. When I returned, the typewriter had completed not just the unfinished letter, but 2 additional pieces of correspondence I'd planned to draft later that week. The completed letters bore my signature not forged, but perfectly reproduced, as if I'd signed them myself without any memory of doing so. More disturbing, each letter carried a papal seal I'd never seen before. An intricate design featuring a triple crown above crossed keys, but with additional symbols that didn't match any official Vatican heraldry in my reference materials. I researched the seal design in the Vatican's archival databases. After several hours of investigation, I found a match in a restricted collection of documents from the 14th century. The seal belonged to Pope Clement VIII, not the 16th century pontiff of that name, but an earlier claimant who was never officially recognized by the Church. This earlier Clement had established a rival papal court in Avignon during the Western Schism, producing documents that were later declared invalid when the ecclesiastical crisis resolved. Yet somehow, my typewriter was affixing this non-existent papal seal to contemporary correspondence. Over the following weeks, the supernatural assistance intensified. Each evening at sunset, as I prepared to leave my office, the typewriter would begin operating autonomously. I could hear the mechanical keys striking paper from outside my locked door, producing documents I hadn't initiated. The typing continued for precisely 1 hour, stopping when darkness fell completely over St. Peter's Square. The letters produced during these sessions addressed correspondence I'd planned but hadn't yet begun. More unsettling, they responded to inquiries that hadn't yet arrived, answering questions from bishops who wouldn't submit their requests until days or weeks later. The supernatural correspondence demonstrated foreknowledge of church business that extended beyond any rational explanation. The Latin grew increasingly sophisticated. Early letters used standard medieval formulations, but later documents employed complex theological terminology that suggested doctoral-level expertise in canon law and church history. The syntax reflected intimate familiarity with centuries of papal communications, incorporating stylistic elements from different historical periods with scholarly precision. During the 4th week of Lent, I decided to observe the phenomenon directly. I remained in my office past sunset, pretending to work while monitoring the typewriter from my peripheral vision. At exactly 6:47 in the evening, the moment when daylight faded below the horizon, the machine began operating without human intervention. The keys depressed in rapid sequence, producing text faster than any human typist could achieve. But the movement followed an unusual pattern. Instead of the random rhythm typical of human typing, the keys struck in groups, as if multiple fingers were working simultaneously across the keyboard. Occasionally, the carriage return lever would activate without any visible force, advancing the paper to begin new lines. I approached the machine cautiously, trying to read the text as it appeared. The letter began with standard salutations, but quickly developed into content I'd never conceived. The invisible correspondent was drafting a theological treatise on the nature of papal authority during periods of ecclesiastical divisions, specifically addressing whether legitimate papal power could exist outside official church recognition. The document argued that spiritual authority transcends institutional validation, citing biblical precedents and patristic sources with scholarly detail that indicated extensive research in Vatican archives I'd never accessed. The argument suggested that the unrecognized Pope Clement had possessed authentic papal power, despite the Church's later denial of his legitimacy. As I watched, the typewriter began addressing me directly. Without changing its mechanical rhythm, the machine produced text that acknowledged my presence and responded to my unspoken questions about what I was witnessing. Father Okafor, the text read, "Your surprise is understandable but unnecessary. Legitimate authority requires completion of its appointed duties, regardless of historical circumstances that may interrupt its exercise." The message continued. Pope Clement VIII of Avignon possessed authentic papal commission, but was prevented by political circumstances from completing his intended reforms. His unfinished correspondence has waited 7 centuries for secretarial assistance capable of providing appropriate completion. I found myself responding aloud, asking questions about the nature of the phenomenon and its implications for church authority. The typewriter answered by producing immediate text, creating a conversation between my spoken words and its mechanical responses. "Are you the spirit of Pope Clement?" I asked. "I am the accumulated intention of uncompleted papal duties." Authority creates obligation that persists beyond individual mortality. Your office provides the mechanism for fulfilling responsibilities that transcend temporal limitations. The exchange continued for nearly an hour. I learned that the Vatican contains institutional memory that extends beyond human consciousness-accumulated spiritual authority that seeks completion of interrupted duties across centuries. My role as papal secretary had somehow activated this dormant ecclesiastical power, allowing unfinished papal correspondence to achieve completion through contemporary administrative channels. The final letter of that evening addressed the most disturbing question. What would happen when Lent ended and the supernatural correspondence concluded? Father Okafor, your faithful service has permitted resolution of 7-century-old ecclesiastical business. When this season of penitence concludes, Pope Clement's correspondence will be complete, and his spiritual authority can rest. You have participated in the correction of historical injustice and the fulfillment of legitimate papal obligation. The typewriter stopped operating at exactly 7:47 in the evening, after precisely 1 hour of supernatural activity. I collected the letters it had produced and secured them in my personal files, uncertain whether to report the phenomenon or maintain private silence about experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about institutional authority and spiritual continuity. Easter Sunday marked the end of the supernatural correspondence. I arrived at my office that morning to find the typewriter covered with a cloth and a small note in medieval Latin. Gratias tibi ego pro servicio fideli. Thank you for faithful service. The machine never operated autonomously again, returning to normal mechanical function under human direction. But sometimes, when I work late during important church seasons, I hear faint typing sounds from empty offices, suggesting that other secretaries throughout Vatican history may be receiving similar supernatural assistance in completing unfinished ecclesiastical business. Cardinal Torriani never asked about the letters bearing the unrecognized papal seal, though I noticed him examining them with particular interest during file reviews. Some ecclesiastical mysteries, I learned, are acknowledged through silence rather than discussion, permitted to remain private as long as they serve legitimate church purposes. I still work as papal secretary, still draft correspondence that maintains the Vatican's global communications. But now I understand that my role involves more than contemporary administrative duties. Some forms of service transcend individual mortality, and some obligations require centuries to achieve proper completion. The Vatican preserves all forms of legitimate authority, including power that was never officially recognized but nonetheless possessed authentic spiritual commission. Some typewriters serve masters who have been waiting generations to finish their appointed work. Some servants of the church never truly leave their posts, especially when the camera captures what the eye cannot see. My name is Maria Santos, and I've worked as Vatican photographer for the Apostolic Palace for 12 years. During that time, I've documented papal audiences, consistories, and sacred ceremonies that define the Catholic Church's relationship with the modern world. But nothing in my training prepared me for the figures who began appearing in my photographs during the winter of 2024, figures that weren't present during the actual events I was documenting. The Vatican Photography Department occupies a suite of offices and darkrooms in the Apostolic Palace's administrative wing, where we maintain equipment capable of preserving historical moments for the Church's permanent archives. My responsibilities include photographing papal audiences, documenting important visitors, and creating visual records of ceremonies that serve as official documentation of Vatican activities. The work requires technical precision and liturgical sensitivity. Every photograph must capture not just the visual elements of sacred events, but their spiritual significance. Papal audiences aren't simply meetings, they're sacramental encounters where earthly authority intersects with divine commission. My camera serves as witness to moments when human history is shaped by spiritual direction. Despite the Vatican's embrace of digital technology, certain ceremonial photography still requires traditional film development. Cardinal Torriani insists that the most important papal documents include silver halide prints, processed in controlled darkroom conditions, believing that digital images lack the permanence necessary for historical preservation. These traditional photographs undergo development in my private darkroom, where chemical processes create images that will survive centuries of archival storage. The anomalies began during a routine papal audience on December 15, 2024. Pope Francis was meeting with a delegation of bishops from South America to discuss pastoral challenges in remote dioceses. I photographed the ceremony using both digital and film cameras, following standard protocols for documenting official Vatican meetings. The gathering preceded normally formal greetings, presentation of gifts, theological discussion, and concluding prayers. But when I developed the film photographs that evening, I discovered something impossible. In 3 images taken during the audience, additional figures appeared standing behind the Pope's chair-robed forms that hadn't been visible during the actual ceremony. The figures weren't shadows or photographic artifacts. They were clearly defined human forms, wearing traditional clerical vestments, positioned as if they were participating in the meeting despite their absence from the actual event. I compared the film images with digital photographs taken at identical moments. The digital images showed only the participants who had actually attended the audience, but the film photographs revealed these additional presences with perfect clarity, as if they existed in a dimension visible only to chemical emulsion rather than electronic sensors. My first assumption was contamination during the development process, perhaps double exposure or chemical interference that created false images. I re-examined the negatives under magnification and tested the developer chemicals for contamination. Everything appeared normal. The mysterious figures existed on the original film, captured at the moment of exposure rather than created during laboratory processing. Over the following weeks, the phenomenon intensified. Additional figures began appearing in photographs of various papal activities, but only in images taken with film cameras and only during specific times. I began documenting the pattern meticulously, noting the exact timing of each occurrence. The figures appeared exclusively in photographs taken at 3:17 in the afternoon. Not 3:16 or 3:18, exactly 3:17, down to the precise second as recorded by my camera's internal chronometer. Outside this narrow temporal window, film photographs developed normally, showing only the participants actually present during ceremonies. But every photograph taken at 3:17 revealed additional presences arranged around papal activities like invisible observers or spiritual witnesses to contemporary church business. The faces became recognizable during my third week of investigation. While researching Vatican personnel records to document my findings, I discovered that the mysterious figures matched photographs of Vatican staff members who had died while serving in the Apostolic Palace. Not recent deaths, but employees who had passed away decades earlier, secretaries, gardeners, security guards, and clergy who had devoted their lives to Vatican service. The oldest figure I could identify was Monsignor Andrea Giuliani, who had served as papal secretary from 1942 until his death in 1967. His face appeared clearly in my photographs, wearing the same style of clerical vestments visible in archived portraits from his era of service. Beside him stood Sister Margherita Torelli, a Vatican librarian who had died in 1973, and Brother Francesco Alberti, a maintenance worker who had passed away in 1981. Each figure appeared wearing period-appropriate clothing that matched their historical service records. Their expressions showed the same reverent attention they had presumably displayed during their living years of Vatican employment. They stood in positions that suggested continued performance of their former duty secretaries positioned near papal correspondence, security personnel watching doorways, clergy maintaining prayerful observation of sacred proceedings. The implications unsettled me more than the impossibility of their presence. These weren't random ghostly appearances, but evidence of institutional continuity that transcended mortality. The Vatican, it seemed, retained the spiritual presence of those who had served it faithfully, creating a permanent staff that existed parallel to living employees. During the fourth week of December, I decided to experiment with the phenomenon. I arranged to photograph a routine papal audience scheduled for 3:17 on December 28. Instead of standing in my usual position, I moved throughout the audience chamber, taking multiple film exposures from different angles at the exact moment of 3:17. The resulting photographs revealed the full scope of what I'd been witnessing. The audience chamber contained dozens of additional deceased Vatican employees arranged throughout the room in positions that corresponded to their former duties. Former papal secretaries stood near the Pope's chair. Dead security guards monitored doorways. Deceased clergy maintained prayerful vigil around the ceremony's perimeter. But most disturbing was the realization that these figures weren't simply observing contemporary events. They were actively participating in ways that influenced the proceedings. In one photograph, I could see Monsignor Giuliani appearing to whisper guidance into the Pope's ear during a moment when His Holiness paused thoughtfully before responding to a bishop's question. Sister Torelli stood near a reference table, her hand positioned as if indicating specific documents that might be relevant to the discussion. The deceased Vatican staff weren't haunting their former workplace, they were continuing their service, providing spiritual assistance to contemporary church operations in ways invisible to normal perception, but captured by photographic emulsion at precise temporal moments. I developed one final roll of film taken during that experimental session, and found something that changed my understanding of my own role in what I was witnessing. In the last photograph of the sequence, taken at exactly 3:17 and 30 seconds, I discovered my own figure standing among the deceased Vatican employees. Not my current self-aversion of me wearing clothing from an earlier era, positioned near the papal chair with a camera raised to capture the proceedings. I was looking at my own future death, seeing myself as I would appear decades from now when I joined the ranks of deceased Vatican staff who continued their eternal service to the Holy See. The photograph showed me as an elderly woman, my hair gray but my expression maintaining the same professional focus I brought to contemporary assignments. I stood in the position I always chose for papal photography, suggesting that death wouldn't alter my commitment to documenting Vatican's ceremony sinly, make that documentation visible to future photographers who possessed the right equipment and timing to capture the spiritual continuity that underlies institutional service. I stopped photographing papal audiences at 3:17 in the afternoon. The knowledge of my own eventual participation in this eternal staff felt too intimate for continued observation. Some forms of service, I realized, transcend mortality, but that understanding carries responsibilities that extend beyond professional curiosity. I continue working as Vatican photographer, documenting the contemporary activities of the Apostolic Palace with digital equipment that captures only present reality. I file standard reports about my assignments and maintain the technical protocols that preserve important Vatican events for historical archives. But sometimes, during afternoon ceremonies, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision figures in period clerical vestments maintaining their eternal duties around papal activities. I no longer photograph these moments, but their presence comforts me. When my own time of service ends, I'll join colleagues who understood that devotion to the Church creates obligations that outlast individual mortality. The Vatican employs more staff than appear on any contemporary payroll, and some forms of documentation reveal truths that management never officially acknowledges. Photography, I learned, sometimes captures not just what exists, but what continues to exist in dimensions parallel to normal perception. Some servants of the Church never truly leave their posts, and 3:17 in the afternoon remains the moment when past and present overlap most clearly in the sacred chambers where spiritual authority guides human history. Sacred languages carry more than words. They contain the accumulated spiritual authority of every voice that ever spoke them in service to God. My name is Father Alessandro Grimaldi, and I've served as document translator for the Vatican Apostolic Archives for 16 years. During that time, I've rendered thousands of ancient texts into contemporary languages, preserving ecclesiastical wisdom spanning 2 millennia of church history. But nothing in my linguistic training prepared me for the voices that began speaking through me during Mass in the winter of 2024, voices speaking languages I had studied but never truly mastered, delivering prophecies I couldn't remember making. The Vatican Translation Department occupies a quiet wing of the Apostolic Palace, where scholars work with manuscripts in Hebrew, Aramaic, Ancient Greek, and dozens of historical vernaculars that preserve the Church's earliest communications. My specialization focuses on 12th century papal correspondence, when popes navigated complex relationships with Byzantine emperors, Crusader kingdoms, and emerging European monarchies through letters that required sophisticated diplomatic and theological precision. The work demands more than linguistic competence. Translating papal bulls from the medieval period requires understanding the political context, theological implications, and canonical significance of every phrase. These documents shaped church law, defined religious authority, and established precedents that continue influencing Catholic doctrine. Each translation carries responsibility for preserving not just meaning, but the spiritual authority embedded in sacred language. My office contains reference materials spanning centuries of ecclesiastical Latin, Greek patristic texts, and Hebrew biblical commentaries that provide context for accurate interpretation. The atmosphere encourages contemplative study. High windows filter daylight through stained glass, creating an environment where ancient words feel immediate and alive rather than simply historical artifacts. I also serve as celebrant for early morning Mass in the Chapel of Saints Peter and Paul, a small sanctuary within the Apostolic Palace where Vatican staff attend liturgy before beginning their daily duties. The congregation typically includes archivists, secretaries, and other administrative personnel who prefer the intimate setting to the larger public masses in St. Peter's Basilica. The linguistic anomalies began during my work on a collection of letters between Pope Alexander III and the Patriarch of Constantinople from 1174. These documents addressed theological disputes that had divided Eastern and Western Christianity for centuries, written in a mixture of ecclesiastical Latin and medieval Greek that reflected the delicate diplomatic balance required for interchurch communication. The papal correspondence demonstrated remarkable linguistic sophistication, employing technical theological vocabulary that required careful research to translate accurately. As I worked through particularly complex passages, I found myself unconsciously vocalizing the original text to better understand its rhythm and emphasis. Medieval writers composed their letters to be read aloud, and hearing the original language often revealed nuances that silent reading missed. This practice had always helped my translation work, so I thought nothing of spending hours speaking 12th century Latin and Greek in my office. But colleagues began commenting on changes in my celebration of Mass. Father Martinez mentioned that my homilies had become unusually profound, incorporating theological insights that seemed beyond my normal scholarly expertise. Sister Catherine noted that my pronunciation of Latin prayers had acquired an archaic quality that reminded her of recordings from the pre-Vatican II era. Several parishioners approached me after Mass to express how deeply my sermons had affected them, referencing specific points I couldn't remember making. Initially, I attributed these observations to my increased immersion in medieval texts. Spending entire days translating ancient documents naturally influenced my liturgical vocabulary and theological perspective. If my Mass celebration had become more scholarly or historically informed, that seemed like a positive development rather than cause for concern. The first clear indication that something unusual was occurring came from Monsignor Torretti, who attended my Mass on December 19th. He approached me afterward with an expression of confusion mixed with concern. "Father Grimaldi," he said, "during your homily this morning, you spoke in Aramaic for several minutes. Your pronunciation was flawless, better than our biblical scholars who have studied the language for decades. But you delivered theological commentary that referenced church councils that hadn't yet been convened when Aramaic was a living liturgical language. I had no memory of speaking Aramaic during Mass. My recollection of the morning liturgy included only the standard readings and a brief homily about Advent preparation. When I asked Monsignor Torretti to describe what I had said, he explained that I had delivered a complex theological discourse about the nature of divine revelation that demonstrated intimate familiarity with both ancient Semitic religious concepts and medieval scholastic refinements of those ideas. You spoke as if you had personally attended the Council of Ephesus in 431, he said. But you also referenced theological developments that didn't occur until the 13th century. It was as if multiple centuries of church teaching were speaking through you simultaneously. Over the following weeks, similar incidents multiplied. I began receiving reports from parishioners and clergy describing liturgical celebrations where I had spoken in ancient Greek, medieval Latin, or even Hebrew, delivering sermons that demonstrated prophetic insight about contemporary church challenges while employing theological vocabulary from historical periods spanning over a millennium. Most disturbing was my complete lack of memory regarding these episodes. My conscious recollection of each Mass included only normal celebration in contemporary Italian and Latin. I had no awareness of speaking ancient languages or delivering the sophisticated theological content that others described. The disconnect between my memories and others' observations suggested some form of dissociative state that activated only during liturgical celebration. Father Martinez began attending my Masses regularly to document what he witnessed. His reports described a pattern where my homilies would begin normally in contemporary Italian, then gradually incorporate phrases from increasingly ancient languages until I was speaking entirely in Aramaic, ancient Greek, or pre-medieval Latin. The transition occurred so smoothly that many parishioners didn't initially realize I had switched languages. Meaning remained clear despite the linguistic transformation. The content of these ancient language sermons demonstrated knowledge I didn't consciously possess. I apparently quoted from Greek patristic texts I had never read, referenced theological controversies from the first centuries of Christianity that weren't covered in my historical training, and made prophetic observations about current Vatican politics, with accuracy that unsettled senior clergy who attended my Masses. During the first week of January, Cardinal Torriani requested a private meeting to discuss my liturgical innovations. He approached the subject with diplomatic care, acknowledging the positive response my Masses had generated while expressing concern about the unusual linguistic phenomena that accompanied my celebrations. "Father Grimaldi," he said, "your recent homilies have demonstrated theological depth that suggests divine inspiration. But the linguistic manifestations require careful evaluation." He explained that Vatican linguists had analyzed recordings of my ancient language sermons and confirmed that my pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammatical structure matched the historical periods when these languages served as living liturgical tools. My Aramaic reflected first-century Palestinian dialect. My ancient Greek employed theological terminology that matched fourth-century patristic usage. My medieval Latin incorporated stylistic elements that had been lost for centuries. "You're not simply speaking ancient languages," Cardinal Torriani said. "You're channeling the linguistic patterns of specific historical periods with accuracy that suggests direct contact with those eras rather than scholarly reconstruction." The theological content presented an even more complex challenge. My sermons apparently integrated insights from church fathers, medieval scholastics, and mystical traditions with contemporary pastoral concerns in ways that demonstrated synthetic understanding, spanning the entire history of Christian thought. I was delivering theological education that would require decades of specialized study to achieve consciously. Most troubling were the prophetic elements. My ancient language sermons had accurately predicted several Vatican personnel changes, anticipated the content of papal encyclicals before their publication, and referenced global political developments that occurred days or weeks after my celebrations. The accuracy of these predictions suggested access to information beyond normal human knowledge. The climax occurred during my Mass on January 15, 2025. According to Father Martinez's detailed report, I began the homily in contemporary Italian, discussing the gospel reading about Christ's baptism. But within minutes, I had transitioned into ancient Greek, then Aramaic, then a form of Latin so archaic that it required consultation with medieval specialists to fully understand. The sermon apparently lasted 47 minutes, far longer than my normal homilisand, covered the entire development of Trinitarian theology from apostolic times through the medieval period. I quoted directly from manuscripts that were kept in restricted Vatican archives, referenced theological debates that were considered too specialized for general congregations, and concluded with prophetic observations about the future of Christianity that left the audience in stunned silence. But most significantly, witnesses reported that my voice had changed during the ancient language portions of the sermon. Instead of my normal speaking patterns, I apparently spoke with the vocal characteristics of multiple different individuals, sometimes elderly, sometimes youthful, but always carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the historical periods I was discussing. When I regained normal consciousness at the end of Mass, I found myself facing a congregation of clergy and Vatican officials who were staring at me with expressions ranging from awe to concern. I had no memory of the extended homily or the linguistic transitions that had apparently occurred. Cardinal Torriani arranged for immediate medical and psychological evaluation, but the examinations revealed no neurological abnormalities or psychiatric conditions that might explain the dissociative episodes. My brain function appeared completely normal during non-liturgical activities. The ancient language phenomena occurred only during Mass celebration, and only when I was translating medieval papal documents during my regular work schedule. The final diagnosis, delivered with characteristic Vatican discretion, suggested that prolonged immersion in ancient religious texts had created a form of spiritual resonance with the historical voices preserved in those documents. My translation work had apparently opened channels of communication with the accumulated theological wisdom embedded in centuries of church correspondence. I was quietly reassigned to contemporary document translation and transferred to a parish outside Vatican City, where my liturgical celebrations could be monitored less conspicuously. The ancient papal bulls I had been translating were restricted to scholars with specific authorization from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. I continue serving as a parish priest, celebrating Mass in contemporary languages for congregations who appreciate straightforward homilies about practical Christian living. But sometimes, during particularly solemn liturgical moments, I catch myself beginning to speak words in languages I never consciously learned, carrying messages from voices that have been waiting centuries to complete their theological instruction. The Vatican contains more than written documents. It preserves the living voices of everyone who ever spoke sacred languages in service to divine revelation. Some translations require more than linguistic skill. They demand temporary surrender of individual consciousness to allow ancient wisdom to find contemporary expression. Sacred languages carry the accumulated spiritual authority of every voice that ever spoke them in service to God, and some forms of translation permit direct communication across the centuries that separate contemporary believers from the Church's earliest teachers. Time moves differently in the bell tower, where bronze voices count not only the hours that have passed, but those yet to come. My name is Brother Francis McKenna, and I've served as tower keeper for St. Peter's Basilica for 19 years. During that time, I've maintained the mechanical systems that operate one of the world's most famous carillons, ensuring that the bronze bells that call the faithful to prayer continue their sacred duty with precision that has marked Vatican time for centuries. But nothing in my training prepared me for the night when I discovered that the bells ring not only for the living, but for events that exist only in the future's shadow. The campanile of St. Peter's rises 320 feet above the basilica floor, housing 6 bells whose voices have announced papal elections, marked the deaths of pontiffs, and called millions of pilgrims to worship. My responsibilities include daily inspection of the mechanical systems, weekly calibration of the carillon sequences, and maintenance of the computerized timing mechanisms that coordinate bell schedules with Vatican liturgical requirements. The tower contains my private quarters, a small apartment where I live, in proximity to the bells whose care defines my vocation. The arrangement suits my contemplative nature. dawn prayers accompanied by bronze harmonies, evening reflection punctuated by Angelus chimes, and the profound silence of night hours when the bells rest create a rhythm of prayer that anchors my spiritual life to the cycles of sacred time. My daily routine follows patterns established by generations of bell keepers: morning inspection of mechanical systems, afternoon programming of carillon sequences for special ceremonies, evening maintenance of the bronze surfaces that require constant care to prevent oxidation from Roman air pollution. The work demands both technical expertise and liturgical sensitivity understanding, not just how the bells function, but when their voices serve the spiritual needs of the global Catholic community. The Vatican maintains detailed records of every bell sequence, documenting the specific melodies used for different occasions. Papal elections require one pattern, funeral masses another, feast day celebrations a third. Each sequence follows traditional formulations that connect contemporary worship with centuries of Catholic musical heritage. My job includes preserving these musical traditions, while ensuring the mechanical systems perform with reliability that befits their sacred purpose. The anomalous chimes began during my third week of November, 2024. I was awakened at 3:17 in the morning by the sound of bells ringing in a pattern I didn't recognize. Not the hourly chimes that mark standard time, nor any of the program sequences used for liturgical celebrations. The melody was complex, sustained, and hauntingly beautiful, a series of bronze notes that created harmonies I'd never heard despite nearly 2 decades of professional familiarity with the carillon's capabilities. My first assumption was mechanical malfunction. The computerized timing systems occasionally develop glitches that trigger unexpected sequences, especially during periods of electrical storm or system maintenance. I dressed quickly and climbed to the bell chamber to investigate the source of the unauthorized chiming. All mechanical systems showed normal operation. The computer logs indicated no scheduled activity at 3:17. The manual override switches remained in their standard positions. Yet the bells continued ringing their mysterious melody for exactly 11 minutes before stopping as suddenly as they had begun. I documented the incident in my maintenance log and made a note to request technical inspection of the timing systems. Vatican engineers occasionally needed to address software updates or calibration adjustments that could cause irregular bell behavior. The melody itself, while unusual, posed no immediate concern beyond the need to prevent unscheduled disturbances during Vatican sleep hours. But the following morning, I received an inquiry from Cardinal Torriani about the 3:17 bell sequence. He had been awakened by the chimes and wanted to know which special observance had required midnight bell ringing without his knowledge. When I explained that no sequence had been programmed for that time, and that all mechanical systems showed normal operation, his expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Brother McKenna," he said, "the melody you described doesn't match any authorized Vatican carillon sequence. Can you reproduce the notes you heard?" I hummed the melody as accurately as I could remember. Cardinal Torriani listened with growing attention, then asked me to repeat specific phrases. When I finished, he sat quietly for several minutes before speaking. "That melody contains elements of the papal death knell, but with variations I don't recognize. The traditional sequence includes only 7 bells. What you're describing uses all 6 in patterns that would require unusual circumstances." He requested detailed documentation of any future unauthorized bell activity and asked me to record the melodies if they occurred again. His concern seemed disproportionate to a simple mechanical glitch, but Vatican hierarchy often possessed information about institutional procedures that weren't shared with technical staff. 3 weeks later, the bells rang again at exactly 3:17 on a Thursday morning. This time, I was prepared. I recorded the sequence on my phone and made detailed notes about the timing, duration, and specific bells involved. The melody was identical to my previous experience, 11 minutes of complex harmonies that created music more sophisticated than our normal carillon programming could produce. But when I reviewed the recording the next morning, I discovered something impossible. The audio contained only silence. Despite clearly hearing the bells ring for 11 minutes, my recording captured nothing but ambient night sounds. Either my equipment had malfunctioned at the precise moment of bell activity, or the chimes existed in a dimension that electronic devices couldn't detect. I began researching the melody using Vatican musical archives, comparing the notes I remembered with historical bell sequences documented across centuries of papal ceremonies. The work required consultation with musicologists, liturgical historians, and experts in campanology who understood the technical capabilities of different carillon systems. After weeks of investigation, I found a partial match in a restricted collection of papal funeral arrangements from the 13th century. The melody I'd heard contained phrases that appeared in death knell sequences for Pope Innocent IV, who died in 1254. But the Vatican's bells in that era couldn't have produced the complex harmonies I was documenting. They lacked the mechanical sophistication required for such intricate musical programming. More disturbing was the discovery that the melody incorporated elements from papal death, knells spanning different historical periods, phrases from 13th century sequences, combined with innovations from the Renaissance era, mixed with harmonic developments that didn't occur until the 19th century. The chimes I was hearing represented a synthesis of papal funeral music that shouldn't exist in any single composition. The pattern continued every third Thursday at 3:17 for 2 months. Each episode lasted exactly 11 minutes. Each time, my recording equipment captured only silence, while I clearly heard the bells perform their mysterious composition. During my investigation of the February episode, I made a discovery that changed my understanding of what I was experiencing. While researching death knell variations in the Vatican archives, I found a medieval manuscript that contained musical notation matching segments of the mysterious melody. But the document wasn't historical, it was contemporary, written in modern musical notation, dated 3 days after I had first heard the chimes. The manuscript was titled Requiem Sequence for His Holiness Pope Francis, and contained detailed notation for a papal funeral carillon that incorporated bells, choir, and orchestral elements. According to the document's metadata, it had been composed by the Vatican's Director of Sacred Music as part of advanced planning for inevitable future papal transition. But the bell sequences in this funeral arrangement matched exactly the melodies I had been hearing at 3:17 every third Thursday. The chimes weren't random mechanical malfunctions, they were rehearsals for a papal death knell that hadn't yet been officially composed. The implications unsettled me more than the impossibility of the phenomenon. The bells were somehow accessing musical arrangements that existed only in planning stages, performing funeral sequences for events that hadn't yet occurred. Time seemed to flow differently in the bell tower, where bronze voices could echo not just across space, but across the temporal boundaries that normally separate present from future. The climax occurred during the March episode, when I decided to climb into the bell chamber during the mysterious chimes. At 3:17, as the unauthorized sequence began, I positioned myself among the 6 bronze bells to observe their behavior directly. What I witnessed challenged everything I understood about the mechanical systems I'd maintained for nearly 2 decades. The bells were ringing without any activation of their mechanical hammers. The bronze surfaces vibrated and produced sound through some force that bypassed the physical mechanisms entirely. Each bell rang with perfect pitch and timing, creating harmonies that required precise coordination between all 6 instruments. But no mechanical systems were engaging to produce these effects. As I watched, I began to understand that I was witnessing a rehearsal conducted by forces that transcended normal physical operation. The bells were practicing for future duties, preparing themselves for ceremonies that would eventually require their participation in ways their current programming couldn't anticipate. But most disturbing was the realization that the melody was incomplete. The sequence I'd been hearing every third Thursday represented only the opening movement of a longer composition. The bells were learning a complex funeral arrangement, piece by piece, gradually building toward a complete performance that would occur when current planning transformed into actual necessity. The chimes stopped abruptly at 3:28, leaving me alone among silent bells that had somehow been practicing for their most solemn future duty. I never reported my direct observation of the phenomenon to Vatican authorities. Some experiences transcend institutional protocols and require private processing rather than official documentation. But I began maintaining more detailed maintenance logs, noting subtle changes in the bell's mechanical condition that suggested they were being influenced by forces beyond normal operation. The Thursday morning chimes continue, though I no longer attempt to record them or research their origins. Understanding the purpose of the mysterious sequences has made their occurrence less troubling and more poignant. The bells are preparing themselves for service that will eventually be required, practicing with dedication that honors both their sacred function and the inevitable transitions that mark the passage of papal time. I still serve as tower keeper, still maintain the mechanical systems that coordinate Vatican bell schedules with liturgical requirements. But now I understand that my responsibilities include more than technical maintenance. Some forms of preparation transcend human programming, and some rehearsals honor duties that haven't yet been officially assigned. Time moves differently in the bell tower, where bronze voices count not only the hours that have passed, but those yet to come. The bells ring for the present, but they practice for futures that exist beyond current knowledge, ensuring their readiness for sacred duties that time alone will eventually require. Sacred texts require more than careful copying. Some passages demand to be written in the same substance that first gave them meaning. My name is Brother Antonio Reyes, and I've served as calligraphy monk in the Vatican scriptorium for 14 years. During that time, I've hand-copied thousands of pages of sacred texts, preserving religious manuscripts in the traditional methods that connect contemporary readers with 15 centuries of monastic tradition. But nothing in my training prepared me for the morning when my ink transformed into something that shouldn't flow from any earthly quill human blood, that wrote with divine precision while leaving pages that radiated warmth long after the words had dried. The Vatican scriptorium occupies a quiet wing of the Apostolic Palace, where monks continue the ancient tradition of hand-copying religious texts. While printing technology has made our work technically unnecessary, the physical act of transcribing sacred words by hand creates spiritual connections between scribe and text that mechanical reproduction cannot achieve. Each letter formed in careful script, each illumination painted with reverent attention, becomes a form of prayer that transforms both the document and its creator. My daily routine follows patterns established by generations of monastic scribes. Morning prayers in the chapel, followed by 6 hours of copying work broken only by midday meal and evening vespers. The scriptorium maintains an atmosphere of contemplative silence where the scratch of quills on parchment creates the only sound beyond occasional whispered prayers. Each monk specializes in different aspects of manuscript production. Some focus on illuminated letters, others on musical notation, while my expertise lies in reproducing the precise calligraphy that makes ancient texts accessible to contemporary readers. The work requires more than technical skill. Copying sacred texts demands spiritual preparation that aligns the scribe's heart with the holy words being transcribed. Before beginning each morning's work, I spend 30 minutes in silent prayer, asking for divine guidance in preserving texts that carry the accumulated wisdom of saints, martyrs, and church fathers whose lives were devoted to serving God through written testimony. My current project involved creating presentation copies of early martyrdom accounts for the Congregation for the Causes of Saints documents that would be distributed to bishops worldwide as part of ongoing canonization investigations. These texts describe the deaths of saints from the Church's earliest centuries, when professing Christian faith often meant accepting torture and execution rather than renouncing belief in Christ. The accounts required delicate handling. Many original manuscripts had deteriorated beyond normal preservation methods, making hand copying the only way to ensure these testimonies remained available for future study. The work was spiritually demanding, spending hours transcribing detailed descriptions of religious persecution, torture methods designed to force apostasy, and the final prayers of martyrs who chose death over denial of their faith. The Crimson Transformation began during my transcription of the Acts of St. Polycarp, the 2nd century bishop who was burned alive for refusing to curse Christ before Roman authorities. I was copying the passage where St. Polycarp addresses his executioners. For 86 years I have been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? As I formed the letters describing his refusal to renounce Christianity, my black ink gradually shifted to deep crimson, flowing from my quill as smoothly as normal ink, but leaving letters that appeared to be written in fresh blood. Initially, I assumed the change resulted from contamination in my ink preparation. Medieval monasteries occasionally mixed red pigments with black ink to create special effects for illuminated manuscripts, and perhaps residual materials from previous projects had altered my ink's composition. I completed the sentence in crimson, made a note to prepare fresh ink, and continued working. But when I tested the red substance the following morning, the results defied rational explanation. The Vatican's conservation laboratory confirmed that the crimson fluid was human blood type O negative, containing active red blood cells and the complete spectrum of proteins found in living human circulation. Yet the substance flowed from my quill with the same consistency as the lamp-black ink I had prepared that morning, showing no signs of coagulation or the thickness that would make blood unsuitable for calligraphy work. More puzzling was the condition of the parchment itself. Blood should stain organic materials, creating permanent discoloration that would ruin the manuscript. But the pages touched by the crimson fluid remained pristine, showing no signs of absorption or chemical reaction. The blood-written letters appeared as cleanly defined as normal ink, but with an unusual characteristic: they radiated gentle warmth that continued long after the fluid had dried. I reported the incident to Father Martinez, the scriptorium's director, who examined my work with the careful attention he brought to all unusual occurrences in our sacred copying work. He studied the crimson letters through a magnifying glass, tested the temperature variations I described, and consulted with Vatican scientists about possible explanations for blood that behaved like ink while maintaining its biological properties. "Brother Antonio," he said after completing his investigation, "continue your transcription work, but document every instance of unusual ink behavior. Some mysteries require observation rather than immediate explanation." Over the following weeks, the pattern became clear. The crimson transformation occurred only when I was transcribing passages that described martyrdom moments when early Christians chose suffering and death rather than renouncing their faith. Normal theological discussions, biblical quotations, and historical narratives caused no change in my ink, but whenever I reached accounts of religious persecution, torture, or execution, my black ink gradually transformed into the warm, flowing blood that wrote with supernatural precision. The phenomenon intensified during my work on the Passion of Saints Perpetua and Felicitas, the 3rd century women martyred in Carthage for refusing to sacrifice to Roman gods. As I transcribed Perpetua's own Wordshire prison diary describing her preparation for death in the Aranathic transformation occurred more rapidly, shifting from black to crimson within individual words rather than between sentences. But most disturbing was my growing awareness that the blood wasn't simply appearing in my quill, it was flowing from somewhere within my own body, though I showed no signs of injury or blood loss. Medical examination revealed normal health indicators. Blood tests showed typical red cell counts and hemoglobin levels. Yet somehow, my body was producing the blood that enabled transcription of these martyrdom accounts in the very substance that had originally given them meaning. The climax occurred during my transcription of the Acts of St. Lawrence, the 3rd century deacon, martyred by being roasted alive on a gridiron. As I copied the account of his death, how he maintained his faith despite excruciating torture, even joking with his executioners about turning him over when one side was sufficiently cooked, the crimson transformation accelerated beyond anything I'd previously experienced. Blood flowed from my quill so rapidly that I had to pause frequently to prevent it from pooling on the parchment surface. But as I worked, I began to understand something profound about what I was experiencing. The blood wasn't simply biological fluid, it was the spiritual essence of martyrdom itself, the life force that early Christians had willingly spilled rather than compromise their faith. By transcribing their testimonies in blood, I was participating in their witness, creating documents that carried the actual substance of sacrifice rather than merely its description. The realization came with physical sensation. As the blood flowed from my quill, I experienced brief moments of connection with the martyrs whose words I was copying. I felt St. Lawrence's courage in the face of torture, St. Polycarp's serene confidence in divine salvation, Saints Perpetua and Felicitas's determination to protect their faith despite separation from their children. These weren't imagined empathetic responses, but actual spiritual communication across 15 centuries of time. The blood that flowed from my quill carried memories embedded in its molecular structure, genetic memory of faith so strong that it transcended physical death and continued seeking expression through contemporary scribes willing to participate in its preservation. The experience lasted for 3 hours as I completed the Acts of St. Lawrence. When I finished the final sentence describing how his martyrdom inspired hundreds of Romans to convert to Christianity, the blood flow stopped immediately, returning my quill to normal black ink operation. The completed manuscript pages remained warm to the touch, radiating gentle heat that never diminished. When I placed my hand on the blood-written letters, I could feel the spiritual energy that connected contemporary readers with the original martyrs whose testimonies the documents preserved. The pages had become more than copied text, they were reliquaries that contained the actual essence of saintly sacrifice. Father Martinez examined the completed work with reverent attention, testing the temperature variations and consulting with Vatican theologians about the spiritual significance of manuscripts written partially in martyrs' blood. The pages were eventually transferred to the secret archives, where documents requiring special handling are preserved away from normal research access. I was reassigned to copying contemporary papal documents rather than historical martyrdom accounts. The Vatican determined that my spiritual sensitivity to martyrdom texts required redirection toward less intense transcription projects. But sometimes, during particularly solemn copying sessions, I noticed my ink beginning to warm slightly, suggesting continued connection with the spiritual forces that seek expression through sacred calligraphy. The blood-written manuscripts remain in Vatican custody, preserved as evidence that some forms of witness transcend historical documentation. The martyrs who died for their faith continue seeking ways to testify to the truth they found worth dying for, and some scribes are called to participate in preservation methods that honor the ultimate sacrifice these saints made for their beliefs. Sacred texts require more than careful copying. Some passages demand to be written in the same substance that first gave them meaning. The Vatican preserves testimonies written not just in ink, but in the very life force that martyrs willingly spilled to ensure their witness would survive across centuries of persecution and continue inspiring contemporary believers. In the scriptorium, I learned that some forms of sacred copying create connections between past and present that transform both the scribe and the text being preserved. Blood calls to blood across time, and some stories require their original substance to maintain their power to transform human hearts toward divine love.